Welcome to Renewalcast. Today on the podcast, we have a special guest with us today. Jon Harris is with us, and he's going to visit with us about the subject of social justice today. Jon Harris is the host of Conversations That Matter. That is a podcast that you can find wherever you like to get your podcasts, and you can go to the website, worldviewconversation.com, and find more information about that. So without any more, let's just get right into our conversation.
With Zoom, it said when we were live, is this going to show us that too, or
well,
just you?
It shows me that we're live right now. So just want to welcome everybody to Renewalcast today. Thanks for joining us. We have a special guest with us today. Jon Harris is with us. He is the host of the podcast Conversations That Matter. You can find his stuff at worldviewconversation.com. Is that right, Jon?
That's right, yep.
Okay. Jon, maybe just take a few minutes here and just tell us, briefly introduce yourself to our audience and kind of tell us how you got into podcasting and about Conversations That Matter.
Yeah, so I was saved at a young age. I grew up in a pastor's household. My dad's a pastor in upstate New York. And so I kind of always grew up knowing about God. So my testimony kind of starts in a Christian home. I repented, put my trust in Christ at the age of 6, and kind of had a little bit of a crisis of faith, like a lot of kids who get saved when they're young do in my teens, and came to the realization that it was Christ who saved me and not my decision or anything that I could do. I got involved in ministry in college. I didn't want to be a pastor. I didn't want to do anything ministry related, but I kind of got pulled into it because there really wasn't much of a Christian presence at the secular college that I went to. And so I just started a little Bible study, and it grew and became something. I think it was the second largest group on campus, which doesn't always happen. But in this particular case, there was a real hunger there, just no one standing up to represent Christ on that campus. And so from there, I got involved in college ministry and apologetics, because you have to know some of that for college ministry. And I've led a number of college career groups and campus groups, and went to seminary so I could know more, not to be a pastor, just to know more about the Bible, so I could be a better elder maybe someday, be better in my college ministry. And when I was in seminary, I just noticed that the same lies that were being told to me at secular university were coming up at a place where people were being trained to be pastors and learn the Bible. And I just was shocked at this. And I described it as Marxism probably now 5 years ago or so. I remember talking to a friend, and I said, these are Marxist ideas that we're learning, or that we're at least seeing take root on campus. And I didn't hear anyone talking about it. And so after I graduated, I had tried to go through the proper channels at the university, at the seminary, and kind of got shut down more or less. And I decided that I wanted to just help prospective students who might go to the school that I was at, which was Southeastern, know what they were getting into. And I put a video together, and I was going to start a podcast just on things that interested me. My interests are pretty broad, so it wasn't necessarily going to be focused on social justice or even politics. But I put out this one video, and I didn't think it would go as viral as it did, but it went viral. And ever since then, there's just been a huge demand to talk about issues pertaining to social justice. And so I decided to take a few weeks and tackle those issues. Well, a few weeks turned into now over a year, and most of my content has been devoted to this. And I've been shocked at how fast this movement has proceeded and how little resistance it has received from those who really should be giving it some resistance, who have platforms and resources. So I'm just going to do this as long as I think the Lord is using it and wants me to do it. And so that's the gist of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just want you to know that speaking for myself, I know that I've just been greatly helped. I mean, you've put some words to some of the things that I was thinking, and I know some of the people around me as well, just kind of saying, man, this just makes sense.
Yeah.
and just talking about one of your more recent podcasts, a popular one, "Why Are All My Friends Marxist?" That title just kind of strikes you there a little bit. But you said a lot of things in that podcast. Can you just take just a moment and talk a little bit about why you labeled that social justice movement Marxist?
There's a lot that could be said here, but it's not pure Marxism. So a lot of I don't want to call them nerds, but people that really get into the differences between different schools of Marxism would probably be quick to correct me and say, well, this isn't technically, the kind of Marxism that Karl Marx conceived of. And they would be right about that. We're downstream from that, and things have developed over time. And so it's kind of like putting a new engine a new engine in an old car or something, a different model. You can change kind of the aesthetics of it, but it's the same engine. And I think that's what we're looking at with critical race theory. Really all the critical theories with what some people call it cultural Marxism. But there's been a development over time. And so what we're dealing with now in its current form is a combination of Marxism and postmodernism. And some people refer to it by the name critical theory, but it's this idea that there are the haves and there are the have-nots. And it's not necessarily along economic lines like a traditional Marxist would say, but it's along, there's other barriers, there's invisible barriers that we don't always see because we're blinded by our privilege or our understandings. And that's where the postmodernism comes in. And it will set up a hierarchy of knowledge. And so that those with the more oppression, according to the sociologists, really, since they have the godlike view, those who with more oppression have more insight into the systemic injustices that are present in society. And they are the ones with a greater insight. So they're the ones that will naturally be able to address those problems more. And so if you're a part of majority culture or a oppressive culture, you just don't have that knowledge or perspective, and it's your job to listen. And when you listen, what you end up usually hearing is some kind of redistribution scheme. So that gets back to the Marxism, some way of deplatforming traditions, symbols, figures, heroes, even financial aspects, like financial reparations would be part of this, I guess, and quotas like affirmative action and stuff, taking money from one group, giving it to another, but trying to strip majority culture of their influence. And then that's the revolution is those who have been oppressed now are going to be the ones that they're ruling. Essentially, they have a say. And so that's kind of the idea. Of course, it never works out that way. And it never has in any Marxist revolution. There's always a hierarchy. There's always those at the top who end up ruling. And then they usually do away with the more aggressive elements of their revolution because they're a threat to their own power. So I think right now we are seeing what really amounts to a Marxist revolution. But it's just not along those socioeconomic lines as much as it is along, in this case, racial lines, ethnic lines. We're going to see it, and we do even see it a little bit during this, Pride Month, along lines of sexual orientation, gender lines at certain times. When the Me Too movement gets back rolling again, we'll probably see more of that. And but ultimately, it's going to come back to stripping us of civil liberties. And the goal, I think, like true Marxists, is going to be to undercut. They're going to refer to it as capitalism, but really the free market, and it's unfair allocation. And so it's a more complicated way. It's perhaps a more morally usable way in an American society to market Marxism, but that's what it is at the end of the day. It gets you to the same destination. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Another thing that you talked about that was really eye-opening to me was just that what we're witnessing around us is just a religious movement, really. And can you briefly kind of explain that how what we're seeing around us is actually a new religion?
Yeah, someone sent me this morning where George Floyd had died. There's essentially, it looks like evangelical, almost charismatic kind of evangelical worship services going on where people are getting baptized and they have a kind of a rock band set up and people are raising their hands. And it's interesting because I hadn't have thought of this before, but the person who had sent this to me said it looks like they almost have a shrine, like a holy site almost. And it is peculiar. You don't usually see that kind of activity around a place where someone has been murdered. And in this case, though, it's almost celebratory. It's, people are confessing or lamenting their sins and receiving salvation in some way. And so that's just one little window into this. But if you really start examining this whole entire movement, you're going to find they have their own way of discovering and verifying truth, which is wholly opposed to biblical Christianity. Instead of revelation from God, it's revelation from minority perspectives, essentially. And they have their own priests because of that, their own minority figures who are able to at least temporarily absolve you of sin. They can't do that permanently, because if you're part of a majority culture in any way, you're still going to have that stain upon you. But they can at least ease your conscience in some way. Until I guess you have to get it, almost like going to confession in a Roman Catholic sense. They have their own holy books, sociology books that you have to read to get a perspective. They have their own salvation plan. So it starts with kind of like this almost being born again, which is getting woke, understanding the systemic injustices around you. And then you have to go and evangelize others by essentially guilting them or canceling them. If they won't be guilted to your pressure. And so there's just so many areas in which you can see a parallel between Christianity or even other religions and what this is. There's so many religious components to it. And ultimately there's a final state that they're trying to achieve, which is some mode of equity that, and those holding them back from this are, of course, us. We're holding them back. So if they can reprogram people, re-educate them, deconstruct their understandings, or get rid of them, cancel them, then their hope is that they'll be able to achieve equity in the end. And of course, we know as Christians that's not possible. We know that heaven is going to come after death, but they're looking for a heaven on this earth. It's a utopian scheme of some kind. So, and you can see the way that people are devoted to this. They're fanatical. They treat it like a religion. They're very devoted. In fact, a friend of my wife's was posting on social media recently how, and literally using this language, that her church that morning, it was a Sunday morning, was going to a protest. That was her church, and she cried and she had an emotional experience. And so we're seeing this with people, I think, millennials and those younger than millennials, Gen Z, they're very attracted to this, and secularism isn't cutting it. So this is kind of filling that void.
What would you say, John, about if somebody asked you, are you saying that racism isn't systematic in our culture?
Yeah. So it's interesting because there's a few things that the other side likes to use, and if they can prove any of these points, they think they've sold you the whole farm, and you have to kind of give in to the whole entire worldview. So one of those is systemic racism. So they will argue for the reality of it before arguing for authenticating it. So the concept, the abstract concept of systemic racism is, no one disagrees that I know of, at least, that is something that is possible, that could exist, that has existed. And one way to tell would be to look at maybe a law that would say something like, this group is favored, this group is discriminated against. And you could say, well, there's some kind of, in the system itself, built into it, in the legal code, there is a discrimination mechanism of some kind. And so that would be maybe like an obvious way to tell if something is systemic. But what they're saying, they're being kind of dishonest in the way they're approaching this, because if you say, yes, of course, I believe that kind of thing is possible, then they'll say, well, it's happening now. They'll whip out some kind of some sociological figures on disparities between different groups, and then they'll say, well, it's clearly happening, and so you must take our solutions. And my response to that is, you need to prove it first that it's happening in the circumstance, and not only that, you need to prove that your solutions are going to address the problems that you're complaining about. And so in the current situation, it's this kind of invisible systemic racism that they're talking about. They're saying that it's there, but you can't really blame any one person or group of people for it, except white people in general. Yeah. You can't find a law specifically that's necessarily discriminating against one group. You could say maybe this law adversely affects certain groups and certain demographics over others, but you can't find a law that's specifically with the intent of going after certain groups, and it can be proven. And so I always say, look, if you can find me that law, I'll join with you. Well, let's go work through the legal system in a peaceable way, which is hard for some of these people to get rid of that. But if your complaint is there's this invisible boogeyman and we need socialism to cure it, then no, I'm not going with you on that. And so defining our terms and making them say more than just systemic racism, say, what do you mean by that? I think is a proper way to negotiate a conversation like that, because they're assuming a lot of things that they're not proving. So yeah, I hope that helps. I don't know if you, you guys can talk too. I don't know what kind of things you're hearing from folks on social media or in your churches, but it's really an emotional argument. It's usually there's some kind of story. They pull you in with the story because it's really sad. And they say, this is just across the board happening everywhere. Look at these disparities. It's systemic racism, but they never showed you a law. They never should. It's just how do you fight something invisible? And so their solutions always come back to some kind of a socialist scheme of some kind.
I appreciate that. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah.
In our ministries are more rural. Sometimes we think we're immune because we're not in a big city and we're kind of isolated. You think rural areas have a little bit of a hedge between what's going on?
Yeah, well, that's always been the case. Every time you look at an election map, right, you see that the red is always in the rural areas. But it's changing, and it's changing in some ways, I think, because those who are in rural areas are sending their kids to college. And even if they're not sending their kids to college, whoever the local high school teachers are, they're coming from colleges that have indoctrinated them most likely into critical race theory and all the other secular ideas. And so it's definitely in your backyard. You definitely have to be prepared for it. But I think Richard Weaver had written in 1949, I believe it was, he had talked about conservatism being preserved in rural areas. You have to depend on Providence to provide for you if you're a farmer. You're more in touch, I guess, with the realities of life and life in God's creation. So you're seeing evidence of God all around. But in the cities, it's very artificial. It's very focused on progress and productivity. And so his contention was that if churches disappeared from urban areas, that you would see rampant secularism, which is exactly what's happened. And so I think in rural areas, there's a hedge because you have to deal with the realities of life a little more, and you're not constantly bombarded with billboards and all sorts of other means of communication and messaging. Traditions are more easily intact. You have usually you can go to sites that are traditionally important, like graveyards and so forth, and there isn't a skyscraper built there, so you have traditions going back generations. The land is very important, that attachment to land, so there's a hedge there, but certainly you're not immune to it. So you got to be careful, and you got to prepare your kids for when they go out and they go to college or go to the city or suburb, because they're going to they're going to hear that stuff for sure. You can guarantee it.
Yeah. We got several churches looking for a pastor right now, so
do you?
definitely something to look for when you're looking for a new pastor. ask them about critical theory?
Yeah, ask good questions too. That's good questions. Because most pastors can say, I don't agree with that. But you got to probe beneath that. It's not just whether you assent to a label or not. It's what's your worldview? So do you actually ask them about systemic racism? Where do you think it is? Like we were just talking about before. Do you believe in systemic racism? It's, okay, yes. Where do you see that in our culture? What are the remedies for that? Then you start pulling out aspects of their worldview, and you can determine whether they actually believe in critical theory or not, whether they say they do or don't. So that would be my advice, at least.
Yeah, that's good. I think that sometimes we talk past each other a little bit on some of this. Like you said, I was going to take some counseling classes at a popular Christian evangelical school, and I got bombarded with critical theory and white privilege.
Wow.
And all these things. So I dropped out. I just couldn't. I just was really surprised that these things are being taught in, these institutions where you would think that it would be pretty foreign from that. We had a study conference in our denomination a while back on women in pastoral leadership and women in ministry, and one of the things that came out pretty quick in that whole conversation is that it was about experiences of oppression, and at one point in the study conference, we were led in a prayer of lament over how we've treated women. We had a conversation about. We had a conversation today in our denomination about race and these things, and a lot of the solutions were pointed toward reading books, getting to know people, having conversations, and those things.
Was that the Southern Baptist one?
No, we're part of a denomination. Well, I can speak for myself.
I saw they had a Southern Baptist one today. That's why I asked.
No, I was raised Southern Baptist, but the denomination that I'm part of is MB, Mennonite Brethren. We call ourselves mostly Baptist. So that's kind of. So
this has gotten into the Mennonites. That's amazing to me.
Well, and we're definitely in our, the Mennonite Brethren group is a pretty big. It's a small denomination, but it's a large geographical difference, and there's a pretty big difference between those on the California side, in the Pacific area.
Oh, yeah.
We call it, than our area in the Central District. So
yeah,
we're kind of like the Southern Baptists, I guess, in a sense. We look pretty different depending on.
Yeah, well, every denomination's having these discussions and multiple discussions and putting out. One of the disparities, if you want to talk about disparities, is the amount of material coming from these denominations, institutions, parachurches, and it's overwhelming. You got PhDs at a lot of these places. They're working. They're getting paid by churches who are paying them to put together this material. I mean, it's a money-making industry. It's an industry at this point. It's just there's so much of it. And then the responses. I mean, it's like almost like a couple of guys on YouTube trying to respond to it. And you can't respond to all of it. You just can't. So, I've been trying to take those broad concepts that are common to all of these different videos and then create content that will help explain and help people respond. But it's amazing that they're all in lockstep doing this at the same time. And it's no coincidence that that's exactly what's happening in our culture at large. It is a new religion. And for those who are students of history who have studied what happened to churches in Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany, and of course you can look at other examples as well, but those are the two big common ones that people like to compare to. You can see similar patterns, which is scary, of churches going along with whatever the new zeitgeist of the ages, and thinking that, well, we're not, we still have the gospel, we still have Christianity, and then it's like the frog boiling, things ever so slightly until one day, the Apostle Paul will be canceled or something. I don't know that we're too far off from that. You look at some of the things Paul said and Jesus said, and like they're pretty offensive to critical theory. They don't comport. So trying to pack that into critical theory or trying to pack critical theory into the Bible, you cannot do it. It is impossible. One will have to win out. And unfortunately, right now, I think the seeds are being sown for a false religion to win out. And so, it'll be interesting to see what happens, whether the denominations, the members are going to keep their leaders accountable, or whether they're just going to go along with it because they're afraid of being called sexist, racist, homophobic, whatever the name call is. And we need guys who are willing to stand up together. But there's a lot of fear out there. And so, you guys are being brave right now, just in doing a podcast and even talking about these subjects in a, unsupervised, by your denomination setting. So, yeah, I don't know why I said all that, but I felt like I should inspire some people out there to say something, take a stand.
Yeah, it's good. I think we might have lost John somewhere along the line there, but I don't think any of us would agree that racism is an issue. Racism is a sin. You see instances of racism. I guess, how do you define racism? Is there a difference in how some of the people how are you hearing that used today?
Oh yeah.
In the way the Bible would. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, what's the common quip? I don't know who came up with it, but racist is someone winning an argument with a liberal. So it almost has lost its potency with some just because it's overused so much, and people are called racist to, black people are called racist. It's almost laughable at this point. But critical theory, because it has this understanding of systemic racism in which you can be complicit in a system without knowing it. You have racists who've never thought or done anything racist in their life. And by that, I mean they've never actually hated someone because or discriminated against someone because of the color of their skin or some genetic quality. And, they may have gone through life and never have done that, but they're racist because somehow they're benefiting because they have the skin that privileges them in that culture. And that's ridiculous. That's a new kind of concept of racism. And I just heard recently the Webster's Dictionary is going to actually try to change to implement that new term. But the actual concept of racism is not, I don't think it's actually a helpful term to begin with. And there's times I use it, but it's partiality is the biblical term. All right. So if you're showing partiality to someone like the book of James talks about, then you're showing favoritism. Really, that's the root sin, favoritism. And usually for some kind of, you're wanting to gain something from that person. It's a selfish kind of favoritism that discriminates against one person and favors someone else for a selfish end. And of course you can do that along racial lines. You can do that along all sorts of different lines. But that's the root sin. And because we've gotten so far away from that, we're so focused on race, I think, we're ignoring a whole host of sins that have to do with partiality. For instance, I'll give you one example: ideological partiality. Someone who's conservative is completely discriminated against by just about every institution in our culture at this point. We've seen that over the last few weeks. That's partiality on some level, but we don't think of it in those terms. But biblically, if we're going to look at the root sin, it's partiality, not racism. And I'd like to get back to using the biblical language if possible. But yeah, you're not going to find a verse about racism in the Bible per se,
Yeah, common today, they want to say it's systematic, it's unconscious even. So you're
right.
Part of the system and you're not even aware of it, and yet you need to repent of it. And
right.
you can't repent something you don't know about, right?
Yeah. It's like that every culture you go to or any place you go to, really. You're going to have those who are in the majority. I'll give you an example. I go to like a Six Flags theme park. I'm a little taller. I'm not I'm not like a 6'8" guy who's really having trouble, but I'm almost 6'2". So if I get in some of these rides that were made for someone that's 5'10" or 5'9", sometimes I feel like they're making them for midgets when I lock myself in. I could claim discrimination. I could say, hold on, this whole theme park, it was not built with me in mind. It's built for someone who's shorter than me. This is discrimination against height discrimination. And the reality is they have to try to come up with some medium point to be able to service the largest group of people they possibly can, right? So it's a business decision on their end, and it makes perfect sense. It's not discrimination for any nefarious reason whatsoever. But under this kind of thinking, if that were a problem, if they weren't concerned about race, they were concerned about height, then if I were someone, let's say, who was shorter, who was 5'10", then I'm guilty. I'm complicit because I'm having a more comfortable ride, and things are more easily on the eye level for me. And that's stupid. That's ridiculous kind of thinking. But every culture you go in, you're going to find that if they don't speak your language, if they have traditions that you're not familiar with, you're going to feel like an outsider. It wasn't made for you. So what we usually do, and missionaries usually do this, they learn the culture, they learn the language, they try to assimilate and as best they possibly can. But yeah, that there's no assimilation is bad now. That's a bad thing. And so Western European cultures of any kind, whether that's Columbus or the Old South, or I saw some weird ones. I saw the statue of Gandhi now being, I guess, questioned, and the statues of now Washington and Jefferson high schools are being renamed and so forth. So things that come from these cultures, rather than understanding, okay, that's the culture that I live in, I'm going to understand these men, and if I want to put up a new monument or something, I can do that, but I'm leaving those alone. Now it's rip down all of the things that might be viewed as disfavoring, or they're not heroes of minority cultures or oppressed cultures. That's new, and that's not a racist thing, even in the partiality sense. But to have those heroes, but now that it's viewed that way because of a new definition, and so I don't know when it's going to start, but crosses are offensive symbols. Churches could be offensive symbols. That's the majority religion in the United States, right? So the oppressive religion, they tried to convert other religions. How horrible. That's colonialism. I mean, we're not far from that. And I don't think the Christians who are participating in this realize that narrative that they're forwarding now is going to be used against them. And it's coming really soon, I think, at least. So yeah, we just got to stand up. We got to, we got to sound the alarm on this, like you guys are trying to do, and inform our people what these things are. Keep preaching the word of God, and preaching things. The cure for a lot of these things. A lot of these root issues are selfishness, jealousy, bitterness. Preach the opposite of that. Preach thankfulness, the providence of God. It's not white privilege is really overstated. God also has a plan. I mean, if Booker T. Washington could look at his life and say, I'm not saying slavery is good, he said essentially, but he's saying, I'm glad that God used this to bring me to a place where I learned about Christ. If he can look at that, if Joseph can look at his situation and say, which you meant for evil, God used for good, as Christians, we should be able to look at the providence of God. And so I think understanding God's providence, understanding, being thankful to him for the blessings, realizing we deserve nothing, that everything that we're given is a blessing, loving people in the body of Christ that are of all different socioeconomic, racial, gender, all kinds of different backgrounds. If you love the rich white millionaire who goes to your church, it's kind of hard to hate him when you're protesting, because I know a guy like that, and he discipled me or whatever. So I think there's simple ways that pastors can help prepare their congregations to withstand the root of bitterness that critical theory would attempt to plant in the lives of especially younger idealistic people. So hopefully that's helpful for pastors who might be listening.
Yeah, that was really good. Thanks.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, what are you guys seeing? What kind of questions are you getting in your churches? And
well, one of the things that we're seeing a lot, I mean, mostly probably on social media, just because of the platform, but is a lot of the Black Lives Matter, hashtag, and then people justifying, well, we're not for the organization, but we're
right.
But and then you kind of get the biblical examples, of, well, compare this to what Jesus said about the lost sheep. It's not that the 99 don't matter. It's that the one that he went and found was matter. And there's a host of different illustrations out there. I guess how would you respond to that?
Oh, they're so awful. They're so awful. And I'm thinking I might do a video on this, like a short one where I just take memes and kind of rip them apart. Cause I've seen a lot of these things, and I think people are stunned. They don't know how to react, many of them, because there's a lot of assumptions behind those memes. I'll give you, so we'll start with this one. This is a very common one, but you're sitting at a restaurant, there's 4 of you, and the one guy doesn't get served, right? And so he's being discriminated against by the waiter. And so if he says basically my situation here matters, but I don't have food, and you say, well, all of our situations matter. That's ridiculous, because he's the one without food, and they try to make a comparison. It's like, that's like saying all lives matter. Well, here's the problem with that analogy. You're not at a table with 4 people and one of them didn't get served. You're in a restaurant. I like to change the analogy. You're in a restaurant and you're looking around, and there's all kinds of tables in there with all kinds of different people. And some people have been served and some people haven't been served. And it's not even clear that it's along racial lines or anything like that. It's just some people have and some people haven't. And you look at certain tables, and at those tables, the waiter didn't even do anything. Thieves came in and stole the food. Do those people matter, right? So if you have a bigger picture, what they want to do is they want to focus in. This is how it always works. Critical race theory, by the way, works this way. Richard Delgado talks about this in his book a little bit, but they want you to focus on a narrative, like a story that you can really identify with, and then you cry about, attach yourself to emotionally, and just look at that story. And then we're going to do the jump at the end of the story and tell you this is systemic, this is happening all over the place, you don't realize it. But because there's millions of dollars being pumped in to just focus on that one table where that one person is being discriminated against in some way, we're not looking at the various waiters in the restaurant. I mean, look, let's say you have one racist waiter, who's not servicing a certain demographic. Does that mean it's systemic? That means you get rid of the one guy and you're good, right? And maybe that waiter has a number of different tables. And so, he could be affecting more than he realizes, but we're not asking questions like that. What's the motive of the waiter? Why don't you have your food? Why, to use the analogy, why are these other people that happen to be white? Why are they not being served? Why aren't we concerned about those who have their, I'm likening this to like inner city violence, but why aren't we concerned about those who are losing their food at a very high rate, much higher rate, because it's being stolen by thugs who are coming in? And so if you start looking at the big picture, the real jerk seems to be the person who's concerned about only this one situation, right? Because you see that there's a much bigger problem going on. And so, for instance, let's say half the tables, or it's more than half. You really want to run the numbers. I mean, compare police shootings to inner city violence or abortion. I mean, it's, you can't even use the restaurant because it's such a terrible, the human scale doesn't work. But if we were going to try to do that, I would say, okay, at one table, you have this issue maybe. And then look, every other table in the restaurant, people have their food stolen. Maybe we should have security at this restaurant. Maybe that would be a good start. And looking for actual tangible solutions that you can use to solve real problems. Because the people who say Black Lives Matter, they don't care about Black lives most of the time. They heard a story, they're emotionally into it, but they're not looking at, because a story of gang violence isn't thrust in their face, because a story of abortion isn't thrust in their face, they're not emotionally connecting to those things. But if we're gonna, if we're gonna be people who believe in truth, we got to have a paradigm that makes sense of all the facts involved and situations. So So that's a long way to respond to it, but that would be my response is like, why are you focused in on one guy? And why are you assuming that it's racism? That seems like, you're making a false accusation. And so that's one analogy. That, the other ones are like the lost sheep, and again, you just change the analogy a little bit to make it more accurate. Say, hey, there's a lot of lost sheep out there right now all over the place. And, you're assuming that, the reason for the sheep being lost is because they're oppressed. You're assuming that they're the only ones that are lost. And so just kind of zoom out, have a bigger macro view of this, and try to get to a situation where you can actually bring in figures, crime figures, if you can, or just off the top of your head. Anyone can start talking about inner city violence or abortion, because those are pretty, I would think, at least in Christian circles, they're pretty commonly known problems. And then you realize, or put them on the defensive. Just say, why do you think that racism caused that? I still haven't gotten an answer about George Floyd, by the way. Why do you think the officer? Why do you think he was motivated by racism? What leads you to believe that? I never get an answer for those questions. And it's always suggestive. If you get anything, it's all built on assumptions that can't be proven. So we're not supposed to be accusing people without 2 or 3 witnesses. That's a biblical standard. There's a trial being taking place right now. Justice is being done. What's the problem? And so the problem is there's a system that needs to be overturned. And that's where the socialism comes right into it, and it reveals its ugly head. So that's kind of my response to that. But yeah, I can see your congregation, people in your congregation sharing that stuff, because everyone's sharing it right now. It's kind of like the cool thing to do, honestly. So it's a style. So.
What, John, would you recommend for resources that have really been helpful to you, like books, maybe podcasts, or?
Yeah. One of the problems is there aren't a lot. Because, like I said, from a Christian perspective, Christians have not been putting their resources behind this, and the men who probably should have been keeping an eye on this have not. And so what's happening right now is you got guys and who are putting out some resources, but they're mildly critical, but they give a pass to everyone in their denomination. So arguments like, well, you can believe in systemic racism without being a critical race theorist. You hear that kind of thing a lot. And it's trying to provide cover for the guys who are actually promoting critical race theory. And so there's some stuff that I just don't recommend that are coming out of Christian circles. You got to be very careful. I don't, I'm thinking of naming a name, but I'm not going to. But here's positively what I would say. I think right now there are a number of resources that are being created. In fact, I'm working on one right now, and I think you're going to see more coming out. I think Founders Ministries just put out a book based on their documentary, By What Standard, and I think that documentary at least did a decent job for providing here are the working issues here. So I recommend that. I recommend, this is more, not in the Christian realm, but Thomas Sowell's book, Quest for Cosmic Justice, I think is a really good book. It talks a lot about disparities, and it shows you really how when you hear a disparity, like, this certain demographic, that, they're being discriminated against because they're not accepted into universities at the same rate, or they're being shot under these conditions. Or he just goes through and he shows you, you can do a lot with those numbers. And when you actually try to investigate this scientifically, those disparities don't actually prove anything. And in fact, there's other disparities that show discrimination going in opposite directions. And so I think that's a good truth pill right there. I'm trying to think. I feel like I'm drawing a blank right now a little bit. I know there's Enemies Within the Church is going to come out with some stuff this summer, was from what they were telling me. And so that hopefully should be available soon.
About Neil Shenvi.
That was the name I wasn't going to mention, but I mentioned it. Neil. So I'll say something good about Neil. One of the things about Neil that I like is that, so he comes from more of like an engineer background, kind of, or I think he was chemist or an engineer, but he kind of approaches it that way. And so it's very abstract. It's very kind of cut and dry abstract. Here's when he does reviews of books, it's kind of like, here's what this book says. And I think the wheels start coming off though with his critiquing. And I don't know if he sees it or not, but he's one of these guys, I think, who tends to provide cover. And it's not a surprise. He goes to J.D. Greer's church. He's spoken at least two of the Southern Baptist seminaries, Southeastern and Southwestern. I happen to know that other guys who are solid in these areas have spoken at who were going to speak at both of those seminaries were denied. And so, but Neil is in there, and there's a reason Neil's in there. I think every time Neil's been confronted, from what I've seen at least, and I don't see everything, but every time I put out material or we've shown, hey, this is Matt Hall saying he's a racist, and so Neil always without fail just about defends those guys, tries to say it's not really critical race theory, and so once you get super technical, like I was saying in the beginning of this, and you start saying, well, critical race theory is, let's say, these 5 different things that you have to believe. Well, look, this person only believes 4 of them. They're really not a critical race theorist. Once you start playing that game, then you're getting into ridiculous land. That's like, it's like saying that, Christians believe these 5 things, right? And so if you take out one, the person's not a Christian. Now, we can say that in a salvific sense. Yeah, maybe they're in heresy land. But we can also say, well, there's a basic Christian worldview. Like Thomas Jefferson might be a good example of this. He's not a Christian in the Orthodox sense, but he's bringing in a Christian worldview with the way he approaches politics. And so these guys are bringing in a critical race theory worldview in the way they're approaching these cultural questions, even if they don't subscribe to the common one is materialism. I don't believe in materialism, so I can't be a critical race theorist. Well, no, you're Christianizing it. And that's exactly what the 70s, the guys in the 70s like Jim Wallace and Ron Sider and Sharon Gallagher and Richard Mao, they were doing the same thing in Christianity. They were Christianizing Marxism, and they even admitted it. There's an article in Sojourners, which is Jim Wallace's organization, in 1977, I think. It was Tom Finger, who was this professor at Northern Baptist Theological Seminary. He says, we can use Marxism as an analytical tool. I mean, it sounds a lot like Southern Baptists and their use of critical race theory. So all that to say, I would be careful of guys who try to give you such a finely tuned definition and really only focus on the radical extreme elements, because the radical extreme elements aren't the ones that are going to convince your congregation that this stuff is true. It's the more quote unquote moderate, the people who come at this. I'll use Al Mohler as an example. It's someone who comes at this with, well, there's a stain of racism that will never go away and until heaven. So we got to lament it every year at the SBC. We got to have another resolution that tackles racism in some way because it's never actually solved. Well, that's an aspect of critical race theory. But Al Mohler's not a full-fledged critical race theorist. But that's the lie. And so it's actually good to critique that and say, hey, why are you buying into this ungodly worldview over here? Other resources out there just came to my mind. I think Michael O'Fallon has some good videos at Sovereign Nations. If you've seen those, the Trojan Horse is the first one he put out. I think that would probably help you, help your people. And they might have to watch it a few times because it's pretty heady stuff, but that's good at describing kind of what's happening. Critical race theory is evolving, so you can't ever pin it down. And that's why someone who tries to distill it and put it into, systematize it like a Neil Shenby, I just, his book's going to be outdated in a few years because it will have changed by then. And that's one of the key, hallmarks of postmodernism. It can morph. And so kind of like the guy who is the banker and wants to know a fake $100 bill, it's good to just know the true bill. And so teach your people justice principles from Scripture. I know there's a lot of good books out there just on justice in particular. And you can and once they understand biblical justice, then they can spot the fake. That'd be my advice. So I hope that helped.
Yeah, very, very good.
Yeah, that was good.
You brought up something else though to me that I wanted to just kind of ask you real quick too. As pastors, we're trying to shepherd, but there's, like you said, there's so many people that are buying into this. This kind of evangelical way of looking at this, that's incorporating all these different things. So somebody on Facebook, actually, Caroline on Facebook just asked, what do you do when your pastor tells you need to read a book like the Color of Law?
Don't read it now. Yeah. So if your pastor, I don't know exactly where that question's coming from. I think it sounds like maybe they're asking, should I leave the church? Should I confront it? I'm getting a lot of questions like that. People now trying to start their own churches because their pastor, did this, started praying a prayer of lamentation that was completely chock full of this stuff, or, is trying to push books like that. I without knowing the pastor, without knowing the person, it's kind of hard. But in general, I would just say that you want to make it clear where you stand. You want to figure out where you stand as best as you can first. And once you understand, I would watch that Trojan horse video. I would watch, I put out some videos on critical race theory. You can just search them on YouTube, but you read Quest for Cosmic Justice, look at the Founders Doc. That takes a few days to get through some of that stuff, or maybe even a few weeks for some of you if you're busy. But once you've kind of gotten through that and you kind of know kind of where you want to go, then you have a foundation built, and you can dialogue with your pastor. You can read a book like Color of Compromise, and you can come back with your, here are my concerns or whatever. Because a lot of these things are not, the disagreement is not in the facts of the situation. It's not, it's more the solutions. And the facts are important. I dig into that all the time, but it's really like, okay, let's say Jamar Tisby's right. Let's say the United States has been just racist the whole time. That's what it's motivated everything. And here we are, right? I disagree with that completely, but let's just say it's true. What do you do? What do you do now? It's 2020. How do you proceed? And so the solutions are, I think, where a lot of the battle is. And even a layman who doesn't understand all the thing, every aspect of history and economics, so forth, they can at least engage on the moral dimension, the ethical dimension of the solutions to these things. And that's where I would try to talk with a pastor. Say, okay, so what do you want me to do with this? What do you is there a problem in our church presently? Where do you identify it in our church? Something you both know about. How would you biblically approach this issue? Because look, if you really have racists in your church, like real racists, that's a church discipline issue. They're showing partiality, and they've been confronted, and then 2 or 3 witnesses, and then that needs to be progressed to disciplining someone from the church if it's real racism, right? That you're seeing. But if it's not, if it's this fake stuff that's just lamenting, what our grandfathers did or something, then where do you see this in Scripture? You don't see that anywhere in Scripture. Every corporate apology in the Old Testament is it's for sins that those who are apologizing for them were actually participating in some way. So if it was their fathers who had broken the covenant of God, they are also breaking the covenant of God. They're continuing on a bad tradition. So they don't apologize for their father's sins. It's just that, they're in that tradition, and that's where they learned to break God's covenant. But it's vertically, it's to God. It's, I've seen some of these ridiculous apologies of you need to go and to your brothers in the black community or something. It's like, no, you don't. You didn't do anything to them. If you did, then go to the ones that you wronged. But it's not how biblical restitution works. So you're bringing in Marxist concepts when you do that. And so I would just flesh out some of these things with the pastor. And if the pastor refuses, to converse, or if the pastor decides that he doesn't like the biblical solutions, he's going to do his own thing, then I think it's time to start looking for another church. And just make it very clear, though, that's why you're looking. That's why you're leaving, is because of these views, rather than just leaving without saying anything. Because there might be others in the congregation who know something's wrong, but they just can't put their finger on it. And so the discussion needs to happen. You always hear, we need to have a discussion on race, but no one ever wants to have it. The people who say that don't want a real discussion. So have a real discussion. And it's not about race, it's about social justice. So, yeah, I hope that helps.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. This conversation has been very, very helpful. Just want to thank you so much, John, for taking the time to be with us and help us. Again,
My pleasure.
worldviewconversation.com, and you can find John's podcast on pretty much any podcast catcher, right? Conversations that matter.
Yeah, it's about, yeah.
A lot of good stuff out there, and we'll link to those websites and that podcast, and just
I appreciate it. Yeah. Well, Colt, Jay, John, I appreciate your commitment and your time to helping people be equipped for this. And I know, some of my listeners may be even listening in right now. So, they may be a stranger. I don't know how many people you have streaming it right now, but is this where to go? Your Facebook page to find out more about you guys, or the website too?
renewalcast.com.
Okay.
We'll take you to that. And I think this streamed on YouTube. I just streamed it to our church page.
Gotcha.
To go to, so I can put a link to those as well.
Yeah. Well, God bless you guys. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much
Yeah.
for joining.
Thank you, John.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Have a good one.